No, that's true. Unless you have like a cause or something.
Good morning. Welcome to US Japan Research Institute seminars on the reconstruction and beyond, the Great East Japan earthquake and its impact on an aging Japan. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, President of USJI and also Vice President of Waseda University. USJI was established jointly by 5 leading Japanese universities, namely Kyoto, Keio, Ritsumeikan, Tokyo, and Waseda, in order to provide a policy-related academic research result to wider audiences. And here in the United States, we have an office in the center of Washington, D.C. Since the inaugural seminars in March 2009 in Tokyo, every September and February, we have a USJI week here in Washington, D.C. And this week, under the title of Reconstruction after the Great East Japan earthquake, we have 5 seminars, 2 collaborative lectures, open house, and social networking receptions. This morning, we have the seminar 2. And Japan has produced many efficient and competitive manufacturing goods, such as automobiles, computers, and so on. So we are proud of high productivity of prime ministers. And we produced 6 prime ministers within the last 5 years. And September 2009, as the first USJI week, Prime Minister was Mr. Hatoyama. And last September, the Prime Minister was Khan. This time, Prime Minister is Mr. Noda. Among these 3, 2 of them are graduates of our member university, Tokyo and Waseda. And we are very pleased. We have 3 prominent speakers on this topic. The first, the Professor Seike, President of Keio University. And also, he is a member of the Prime Minister's Reconstruction Council in response to the Great East Japan earthquake. He'll give us a speech on the topics of the impact of the Great East Japan earthquake on aging Japan. And also, we have 2 distinguished speakers from the United States. Professor Campbell, he is a Professor Emeritus of Michigan University of Michigan, and also leading scholars of the Institute of Gerontology at Tokyo University. And he lives in Hiro for the last 6 years. And also, the Professor Ramzayer, he is the professor of the Harvard Law School, and he lived in Japan until, I think, 18 years old. And moderator of this seminar is Professor Agawa, Vice Chair of USJI and Vice President of Keio University. And he is also the graduate of the Georgetown University and Georgetown Law Schools. And also he practiced law in Washington, D.C. and New York before becoming the professor of Keio University. Professor Agawa, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Uchida, for your kind introduction. I'm Naoyuki Agawa, and I'm moderator, but only nominally. And since Professor Uchida has done most of my job, let me just proceed to introduce each one of the 3 panelists and ask each one of them to speak each for perhaps 20 minutes. And first, I'd like to ask Professor Seike to come up to the podium and speak about the main theme of this seminar, Reconstruction Beyond the Great East Japan earthquake and its impact, particularly on aging society. Professor Seike.
Thank you very much, Professor Agawa, for your kind introduction. Before starting my presentation, let me thank Professor Uchida and all the staff of USJI for preparing this seminar. And I also would like to extend my deep appreciation to Professors Campbell and Ramzaya for coming to this seminar. They are very well known and distinguished professors, and they happen to be my good friends for long years. And my understanding is they made a big effort to make their trips from their hometowns to here in Washington. My understanding is that Professor Campbell has a very important family event this week, and Professor Ramzai rescheduled his class. So I deeply appreciate your generosity. I can't have any words to thank you. So what I'm going to do this morning is to play a role, sort of a curtain opener in Japanese Zenzat for the great stage on which Professors Campbell and Ramzai will play their major role. Well, the great East Japan earthquake and resulting tsunami that struck on the afternoon of March 11 caused a disaster on an unprecedented scale. And the more we learn about the actual situations in the affected areas, the heavier our hearts grow. The present situation is still harsh. About 470,000 people were affected by the disaster, and about 200,000 jobs were lost. Total losses of tangible assets were estimated as much as 16.9 trillion yen. But this does not include the economic damage derived from the nuclear accident from Fukushima, which I believe Professor Ramzai is going to talk to you later. Aid to the people affected and reconstruction of the affected areas should continue to be our primary goal. The revitalization of the Japanese economy as a whole, which has another large role, is also an urgent issue. It's a big task. So the principle is that we do not simply aim to sort of restore things how they were, but instead to embark upon a more substantial sort of reconstruction or revitalization of the affected areas. In other words, for example, re-establishing local infrastructure means to reconstruct them so that they are much safer and we have more comfortable local communities than before. And in case of reconstructing of businesses, means to make them more competitive so that they have better prospect in the future. The reconstruction will need substantial support from the government. The necessary public expenditures, therefore, will be very huge. So, when implementing the reconstruction plan, what might be the important variables we need to pay attention to? I believe that one of the most important variables is an aging population. I mean, increasing the proportion of older people. Japan has become the world #1 aging society already, and the affected areas are aging even faster than Japan as a whole. Therefore, in order to ensure the quality of life after the reconstruction in the affected areas where we have a bunch of older people, I believe that the social security will play a very important role. I think that is a story that the Professor Campbell will talk to you later. As a matter of fact, for example, the long-term care insurance system is already playing a very large role to support older people in the affected areas. And this system did not exist at the time of the Great Hanshin earthquake 16 years ago. If it was not operating today, the support necessary for older people, in particular in the affected areas, would have been even more difficult. The aging population as a whole in Japan is also very important when we think about the finances necessary for the reconstruction. Please look at table 1 in your handout. At the time of the Great Hanshin earthquake, Japan's aging population, the proportion of older people aged 65 years old and over, was still less than 15% of the total population. Of course, 15% of older population is already high in the global standard, but it was still 15% if you look at from the current situation in Japan. However, it is already close to 24% this year, and in 2 years from now, that proportion will reach 25%. A quarter of total Japanese population will be older people aged 65 years old and over within 2 years. As a result, the public expenditure for Social Security, including public pensions, medical service insurance, and long-term care insurance, increased from 60 trillion yen at the time of the Great Hanshin earthquake to 105 trillion yen, and is expected to continue to increase. And therefore, at the time of the Great Hanshin earthquake, long-term government debt was still 3/4 of GDP. Again, the government debt proportion of 3/4 of total GDP is already high. But if you looked at from current situation, it was, I could say it was still 3/4 of GDP, but it is now more than 180% of GDP, and this proportion is again expected to increase in the future. So we need to moderate the increase of Social Security expenditure because we need to find some finance sources to support the affected areas. But there is not much room to reduce in medical services and long-term care services because they are directly connected to the human life. So I believe that one possible areas of Social Security expenditure that we can moderate is public pension. Regarding the public pension system, for large risks such as unexpected long life, we should secure benefits that can allow these old people to live a life in dignity. But for smaller risks, such as reaching the normally expected lifespan in a healthy manner, we should let them cope by themselves. This means raising the pension eligible age. In Japan, the country which has the highest proportion of older people and also has the longest lifespan, 65 is not an unexpected age to reach. So I believe that the necessary response now may be to increase the pension eligible age to be closer to 70. By the way, in the United States, where aging population will be expected far less than the case of Japan, is now, raising its pension eligible age from 65 to 67 gradually. Naturally, employment needs to be extended to be closer to 70 if, pension eligible age will be raising to 70. And of course, this may increase the cost of employers if you just extend the retirement age while keeping the seniority-based wage practice and seniority-based promotion practice, which typically seen in the large corporations. But this can be solved by fundamentally revising the seniority-based systems. In a matter of fact, if you look at the small and medium-sized corporations in Japan, it is not uncommon to find companies that have no mandatory retirement practices, or companies that if they have a mandatory retirement practice, they are flexible enough to let their older people to continue working beyond the mandatory retirement age. This is because in these small and medium-sized firms, seniority-based wages are less steep, flatter. And instead of working as managers, older people are able to work as professionals who can utilize their professional skills and knowledges that they have accumulated. In this sense, you can find many small and medium-sized companies in a local area that sit atop their particular field and use their very knowledgeable and skillful older workers. And these older workers, in fact, transfer their accumulated skills and knowledges to younger workers. And the affected areas, in truth, have many older people who continue working, so you could say that they are lighting the way towards the Japanese future. In order to cope with the aging population, it is extremely important for you to sort of establish a lifelong active society in which the will and the working ability of older people can be fully utilized. So a great outcome would be if we can take the reconstruction on the affected areas as a model for a lifelong active society, which will be necessary for an aging Japan in the future. Now, along with an aging population, a globalizing economy is another key variable when thinking about the reconstruction plan. In the first instance, there were many rescue activities undertaken by foreign countries just immediately after the earthquake happened. In particular, efforts from the US military, known as Operation Tomodachi, was very helpful. The early rescue and restoration activities really made a great difference, for which we are truly grateful. And economically, since the disaster, we have come to know that the affected areas were sort of the very important part of the global supply chain. So the affected areas were indeed connected to the rest of the world. And it was this connectivity that made the reconstruction possible. And as over the long run, Japan's population is shrinking, which means that domestic markets will also shrink. The point I just said can apply to Japan's economy as a whole. Japanese businesses will have to depend more on the international market or foreign market. If Japanese companies do not expand their sales abroad, global sales, Japan's economy will not grow, and therefore the finance for the reconstruction cannot be guaranteed. As a matter of fact, Japan's reliance on the global market is still relatively low comparing to other developed countries. Please look at the figure 1 in your handout. You can see the sort of proportion of exports over GDP in major countries in that figure. As you can see in that figure, Japan's export dependency ratio was still 17%, I mean less than 20% in 2008, whereas that of Germany was 48% and of France was 27%. Of course, in the case of Germany and France, they have exports and imports within EU, so they have naturally have a relatively higher export dependency rate. But even though I think there is more room for Japan to expand its export capacity. Although negotiations for free trade agreements such as EPAs and TPP, I mean Trans-Pacific Partnership, have more or less stopped since the disaster. These should be agreed as soon as possible for the sake of the reconstruction and to help the Japanese economy recover. Of course, industries and areas which will bear the effects of these agreements should receive all necessary assistance. However, the improvement and expansion of free trade framework is something we should hesitate on. So we must achieve both the reconstruction of the affected areas and revitalization of the Japanese economy as a whole. That must also be done under the effect of an aging population and on increasing globalized economy. Due to an aging society and falling birth rate, population decline is unfortunately maybe unavoidable. Of course, even if population does fall, it is very important for us to try to all efforts to stop working population from decreasing as possible. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important or essential to promote the employment of older people. Promoting the employment of women is important as well, as is the need to have highly skilled foreign workers come and work in Japan. However, even with these steps, a decrease of the working population over the long run is unfortunately unavoidable. So it is extremely important for us to increase the productivity of each worker. Okay. In particular, in the developed countries like Japan, what was important was not just simple physical productivity increase, but the improvement of value-added productivity. What we need is the creativity to make goods and services that have high added value and insight to know just where these high value added products and services will sell at a high price, and the high technical skill and knowledge needed to produce high quality or high value added goods and services. And what creates high added value is, of course, people. In this sense, education and training are essential to create human capital. Universities will play a very important role here. What is really necessary is the creativity to produce new value, the ability to analyze and understand new circumstances, and the ability to solve problems based on that understanding. This is ability to discover a problem, construct hypothesis why this problem has occurred, verify that hypothesis by objective means to arrive at a conclusion and solve problems based on that conclusion. This is a process of thinking for yourself and is nothing less than the process of the scientific way of thinking. In other words, for whichever industry and for whatever situations, the ability to think for yourself when necessary is gained through the scientific way of thinking, which is exactly why university education fulfills a very important role. A wide-ranging liberal arts education, the writing and presentation of your thesis, which was made through over your study, and also even extracurricular activities when you are presented with problems that need to be resolved. All these more and precious opportunities for you to improve your ability to think for yourself. Finally, I would like to emphasize that society needs to have an ethos that values learning, by which I mean science. In an era of vast change, thinking for yourself to solve a problem of various kind of problems means being able to apply the discipline of the scientific way of thinking. And needless to say, this way of thinking helps you to have a mutual understanding between people who have different cultural backgrounds. For these reasons, learning and human capital investment are essential for the future society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Seike. I failed to mention the fact that on the other side of the flyer, there a brief description of each panelist's background and expertise. And the most important thing is that Professor Seike is my boss. Next, I would like to ask Professor John Clayton Campbell to come up to the podium and give you a speech. He's an expert on social security system development of social security system in Japan.
Thank you very much. I'm not actually talking about the development of the Social Security system in Japan so much today, although I'll touch on it. Listening to Professor Seike's speech, I knew him when I was a visiting professor at Keio, and he was a very young assistant professor and was quite capable of making fun of his more senior associates, but since he's become president of the university, he's become very serious. And he's losing his hair, but it's impressive. Happily, I am retired basically from the University of Michigan and have no responsibilities whatsoever, so I can be irreverent, I hope not irrelevant, in making what I hope will be provocative or somewhat contrarian statements about about three aspects of the disaster and then a little more generally. My first topic is how did old people fare in and particularly after the disaster, up until now, a topic that's gotten a lot of publicity. My theme about the Japanese government's efforts to deal with the problems of the disaster, where there certainly were some mistakes, and I'll mention a couple, but by and large, I don't think the government did too badly. If you followed this either in the New York Times or in the Japanese press, you would know that the level of the intensity of criticism of how the Japanese government has dealt with these problems has been very, very high, and I think that's really unwarranted in some respects. My second point has to do with the question of rebuilding. And it's another popular point that you see all the time, that it is really difficult to rebuild the Tohoku area because there's so many old people there. And I actually think the opposite is the case. And my third point is a more general one about more at the level that Professor Seike was talking about macroeconomy in Japan, where I don't see population aging as quite the disastrous problem that most observers see. I think it's a problem, but not that big a problem. So these are my three themes for my 20 minutes. First, to talk about the disaster of the elderly. As we all know, on the order of 20,000 people were killed or were missing. Nowadays, we can pretty much assume that all 20,000 were killed. And of those, over half were over 60. The frail old people in particular, as you might imagine in the case of a tsunami, were disproportionately affected. The same thing had been true in Kobe earthquake, the Hanshin earthquake, for different reasons. Older people, also the death toll, more than half were over 60 in Kobe, but not because they couldn't get away from a wave. It was because they disproportionately lived in these old houses, wooden framed houses with tile roofs, and the roofs collapsed on them and they were killed that way. The earthquake caused very little damage in Japan, as you probably know, at least in terms of human life, but the tsunami was as you can imagine, for older people living at home, it was difficult for them to get away, and many of them were killed. Older people had a tough time after the tsunami in many ways. Japan had about 100,000 people in shelters. Also, 30% of the population around that area is older, and that was a large percentage of the people in shelters. And they had a somewhat different. They certainly, taking care of them and so forth, were added problems within the shelters. And since the time in the shelters, people have been moving into temporary housing. There's now about 45,000 units of temporary housing that have been built since the disaster, and it's a giant theme as to people being lonely, losing their social connections, people dying alone, and how to maintain people in this circumstance when they're taken out of their communities is certainly a serious one. But in all these regards, it's interesting that quite a lot of lessons were learned from the Kobe or the Hanshin earthquake. First of all, people were aware of the problems of older people in shelters, and where in Kobe they were kind of marginalized because they weren't active enough to be able to make space for themselves. This wasn't true in Japan. They were in Tohoku, they were really prioritized, and people at least made efforts to deal with their problems. In fact, they were pretty quick for quite frail older people to get them into a facility. And the nursing homes and other sorts of facilities in Japan were flexible. Even now, I just saw a statistic that there are about 780 people above the tein, above the extra people above what a nursing home is supposed to have through the 3 affected prefectures. But there were a couple of thousand earlier, and also they moved to Nagano or to Niigata Prefecture, other places, to take them in. So there certainly were cases of people. There was an estimate that since the earthquake, something like 550, maybe, not quite that many, should be added to the death toll of the earthquake because they died of disaster-related effects after the earthquake, such as inadequate care in shelters and dying. Most of those people were older as well. So the situation was tough, but again, learning from Kobe, the final thing with regard to, there was an enormous amount of publicity in the Hanshin earthquake about loneliness, people dying alone, and if you pick up a Japanese newspaper today, actually, if you Google, in Japanese Google, if you Google the word temporary housing, kasetsu jutaku, the first item just defines it, the second item is loneliness of old people in temporary housing after the disaster. In other words, it's been an immense topic, and people are trying all sorts of ways to have provisions built into the temporary housing to bring people together and organizing things so that they won't be so alone. So all in all, whoops, I'm sorry. The final point that Professor Seike mentioned, and it's actually the topic I've worked a lot on, is long-term care. And as compared to Kobe in particular, long-term care provided a framework for services for people. Something like 16% of Japanese older people are getting benefits under long-term care, either in facilities or many more of them at home. And it took a couple of weeks after the disaster to reconstitute it, but then people were back with their same home helpers visiting or going to daycare services or getting other kinds of services through this, which provided structure for the people in somewhat the way that going back to school, I think, did for school children, which was very important. How would we grade the Japanese performance in dealing with the aftermath of the earthquake? As I mentioned before, media criticism of the government's performance has been intense, particularly in the New York Times, but also in Japanese media, with regard to the elderly or with regard more generally. And on an absolute standard, you can find all sorts of things that people did wrong, but as professors, we learned to grade on a curve and to kind of see, and if we think of how the Japanese government both prepared for the disaster, leaving aside not knowing it was going to be such a big tsunami, but and then how they reacted to it afterwards. And we compare it to the United States in Katrina or to other behaviors of governments, or that we could even imagine other governments behaving. It seems to me that they get pretty good marks. But I will briefly say that a lesson that comes out of this experience, more than earlier ones, is that Japan really badly needs something like a FEMA. And the FEMA of the Clinton administration, or of today, not the FEMA of the Katrina era, obviously, I mean a well-run agency, but something that can cut through bureaucratic red tape. There was story after story about trucks loaded with food that weren't allowed on the expressway because they needed a special permit, commercial trucks, because the expressways were closed except to emergency traffic, and you needed a certificate from the police, and they couldn't find the police. So for a couple of days, that really hindered things. And all sorts of jurisdictional barriers. Towns couldn't cooperate. The people, the Shakatoshi Kyogikai that were handling most of the relief efforts, the unit in one town couldn't cooperate with a unit in another town. It had to go through the prefecture, but as usual, the prefectural level was hopeless. Organizations couldn't cooperate. And this doctrine of fairness, which meant that unless everybody could get some benefit, then nobody could. So there were goods that were just kept in warehouses because they couldn't figure out a fair way to allocate them. Or that because you had to be fair in allocating access to temporary housing, you couldn't do what is the system that works pretty much the best, which is move a whole community of people into one unit rather than having a lottery to get into housing. And all these sorts of things. All of them are kind of understandable why these regulations existed, but in the cases of an emergency of this size, there needed to be some kind of authority that could cut through and make quick decisions and work their way through these. And an organization dedicated to that, it seems to me, is the right way to do it. Let me turn now to the rebuilding topic. It's commonly said in trying to rebuild that having a lot of older people is a big minus. They don't have much energy, they lack the resources, they don't have the spirit to pick themselves up anymore. They kind of give up. New York Times story talked about a barber who was 75 years old, and he says, gee, I don't think I can rebuild my barber shop and all. And this is a very common view, but actually I went to a meeting with Professor Io Jun and Professor Io Kibe, who are heading the committees to talk about Reconstruction. And I raised this question with them, and they had both recently been in Tohoku, and they said, people that say that haven't met a lot of old people in Tohoku because they are very feisty and very energetic and very, very much attached to their towns and committed to rebuilding. And so that spiritual factor doesn't mean that much. And even in economic terms, a town with a lot of older people has a bunch of advantages. They have less reason, either push reasons or pull reasons, to go anyplace else. Less reasons to leave where they are, and less chances, less opportunities elsewhere. So they're likely to be more committed to, they don't have the exit strategy, so they have to do voice and stick where they are. A very important point that Professor Seiki touched on is that older people have pensions in Japan. That means there's income flowing in without their having to have a job. The biggest economic problem in these devastated areas at the people level is that people don't have jobs. And so if income is coming into the town, so people will be buying goods and services without having to have a job, that is an enormous plus. I visited a town called Yamakoshi, which was the epicenter of the Chuetsu earthquake in Niigata Prefecture in 2004. And this town was almost completely devastated. 230 of its 290 houses were destroyed, and it was cut off. People had to be lifted out by helicopter. Their famous fighting bulls were lifted out by helicopter, a dramatic piece of video of that. And the town was rebuilt in 2.5 years, but I talked to the people there, and they said of the gross national product of their town, in effect, of all the money that came into their town, half of it was from pensions, because at this point they were over 40% older people. So it's really pension income in these older people that are sustaining rural areas in Japan. Actually, frail older people are a source of employment, particularly for women. What jobs there are in these areas is mostly for men, except the people that are service providers under long-term care insurance, where people are entitled to lots of services. And in many, even before the incident, in many rural areas in Japan, the providers of long-term care services were the #2 employers in Japan, after City Hall. You go to these rural areas and home helpers running around in their little cars to visit people and everything. It's quite a sight. So in a way, the older people are a backbone of the basic economic vitality of these places. If we compare the micro and go from the micro to the macro level, it does seem to me that these fishing towns along the coast, and that's mostly what were affected, they do have a strong economic basis. The Sanriku coast is one of the richest fishing areas in the world. Demand for fish is going up in the world, and the kind of close offshore marine industry that employs so many of those people is actually well suited to 3-generation sort of enterprise, it seems to me. So there is an economic base there. And rural Japan certainly has a long-term economic decline and population decline. Nothing is going to reverse that. But the disaster towns may actually do better than average, and their elders there are going to be a plus. But what about Japan as a whole? Isn't population aging the biggest threat that faces Japan these days? This is a field that is sometimes referred to as catastrophic demography. The argument that population aging is going to lead all of us to rack and ruin. Heaven only knows it's a popular theme in Washington these days, especially with Robert Samuelson writing his column twice a week in the Washington Post on this theme for the last 15 years, I think. It basically is an ideology held by conservative ideologues and economists who want to wipe out pension programs or healthcare programs so that the government won't be stuck with these enormous costs of the aging society. Well, if this is true in the US, where we now have 13% of the people over 65, Japan is really the poster child for this kind of argument. Now 23% of the population over the age of 65 and over. And it certainly is often said that it was population aging that caused Japan's lost decade or lost decades, the normally regarded as mediocre economic performance of the last 20 years, and that is going to prevent future growth in Japan. And I don't think that's true. The reason why aging is supposed to, this is a long argument, I'll give you the 30-second version, but aging should hit growth basically in 2 ways. One is you have fewer workers, and economists will always use a thing that production equals the number of workers times productivity equals production. Paul Krugman wrote a column on this about 6 or 8 months ago. And the second point is that as people are not working and they're retired, the savings rate goes down, so there's less money available for investment. It's a very plausible economics 101 kind of a story, but when you confront the actual facts in Japan for the last 20 years, we realize there is no labor shortage. There's been a labor surplus in Japan. Japan has had unemployment, actual recorded unemployment or disguised unemployment, for all of these 20 years, and for, sad to say, the foreseeable future. So if you don't really have a shortage of workers, where is the problem? Moreover, Japan has been awash in money. There's just no place worth investing because demand is so low, but there certainly has been no shortage of cash available in Japan. So the argument that it caused the problems of the last 20 years really does not stand up. And it does say, this is pretty much my last point, that although aging certainly does have some economic problems, paying for pensions is a problem, paying for healthcare isn't such a big problem in Japan because they have a far more efficient healthcare system than we do. That's the Americans' peculiar dilemma. But how important is it, as we think of the various economic problems that are facing Japan today, where would we rank population aging in that? And this is something I borrow from a lecture I've done several times in Japan before the disaster, slightly altered, which is I present a list of the plausible problems of the Japanese economy these days. And I ask the audience, I used to ask the students, which of these do you think are the most significant, or which of these do you think are the hardest to deal with among these serious problems of low growth over a long period and stagnant incomes, of growing inequality in Japanese society? The task of rebuilding Tohoku is the one I added. The lack of jobs for younger people because of seniority system and so forth. It's very hard for younger people to get jobs. The high level of government debt, and then finally population aging. And what order would you put them in? Well, I tip my answer off on the bottom. It seems to me the problems are as listed from the top. Population aging is the least of them and the most, the one that can best be dealt with, partly because it happens rather slowly. It happens at a rate of a little under 1% a year to deal with these issues, and markets can adjust and government policy can adjust. So to sum up, Japan faces some big challenges in rebuilding Tohoku, but having so many older people is more a plus than a minus. Second, for the whole economy, population aging is the least of Japan's problems. And finally, the government, in my opinion, performed pretty well after the disaster, relatively speaking, although there are some lessons for the next disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Campbell. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Mark Ramsaya, my friend, and who does a lot of interesting researches and thinking about Japanese legal system. So, Ramsaya, please.
Yes, thank you very much. This is just a wonderfully flattering and kind invitation from President Seikit to be able to come and talk to you. So it's a real delight. I've been sort of for the last several months working on a project to try to figure out, in a sense, why Tokyo Electric put its reactor where it did, and this is a chance for me to learn from you as to what your thoughts are on some of the ideas that I've come up with. So thank you very much for this invitation. The way Professor Campbell put it is, is population aging a problem? That's not my paper, but I do remember one of the last few birthdays talking to my father and complaining about aging, and his response was, "It beats the alternative." Yeah. Thank you. I like it. It's good. Now, so the question is that I'm posing is why are these reactors put where they are? But it's sort of a bigger question: is there a way to do nuclear technology more safely? And that's more interesting to look at. The bottom line is that privately owned public utilities will always have an incentive to put reactors in dangerous places. This just goes to what we call, as academics, moral hazard. You're not bearing the full cost of the decisions that you make because your liability is necessarily capped by what you have, right? I mean, it's what my sister-in-law refers to in the sort of American idioms as, you can't squeeze blood out of a turnip. If it's not there, you don't have to pay. And that's limited liability. It's basic to corporate law, and it affects the decisions that companies make. But then what I want to close with is that governments are not any better. And it's not something that you can complain about. It's just the way things are. It's the basic electoral dynamics of modern wealthy democracies combine to produce an incentive that replicates almost perfectly the moral hazard that privately owned companies will provide. So what do we have? We have in Japan a lot of nuclear reactors. Basically, about 30% of the Japanese electrical power is produced by nuclear reactors. This was scheduled to go up, and we can all bet that it's not going to go up, it's going to go down. That raises up the obvious question of what comes in instead, and we'll wait and see, I guess. Now, these things are not placed in particularly safe places. It's not as though Japan has very many safe places to put reactors. It's, in a sense, the whole country is on a fault line. But some places are worse than others, and Fukushima is a notoriously bad place to put it. It's the reason, let me sort of go into the moral hazard explanation a little bit more. The reason that privately owned companies will put reactors in places like this is because the nuclear reactors impose on society a cost, right? I mean, it's a probabilistic cost. It's the fact that if something bad happens, and the probability that something bad will happen is not 1, but it's not 0 either, then the cost will be enormous, right? And what matters here is that those costs will be greater than what the company can pay. It's just the way it is, right? Tokyo Electric is a very large company. It does not have the assets to pay for the damage that happened. And what that means is that when companies make decisions about investing in these reactors and where to place them and all the decisions that go into this, they will not be equalizing costs and benefits on the margin, which is what you want them to be doing, because they won't be paying the full costs, right? That is, they will say, look, and this is just the way the world is. You complaining about it doesn't do any good. They'll say, look, if something bad could happen, what are we going to have to pay? Well, we go out of business, so what's the amount that's at stake? And that's the amount. It's not the total damage that society bears from this. Okay? Now, let's think about the way in which this disaster gets discussed. Okay? And this is from the New York Times. And this is exactly the sort of PowerPoint that aging professors put up, because younger professors realize that when you use PowerPoint, you should never have 55 words on a PowerPoint slide, because it just doesn't make any sense. But, I am an aged professor. So what does it say? Well, this is from the New York Times. It says, look, we only work on precedent, and there was no precedent, says the engineer from the Daiichi complex. When I headed for the plant, the thought of a tsunami never crossed my mind. Japanese engineers working on nuclear plants predicted what they believed were maximum earthquakes based on records, right? And that approach did not take into account serious uncertainties like faults that had not been discovered or earthquakes that were gigantic but rare. And that's the sort of the standard wisdom, at least in the United States, about this. And it's, you look at this and you think, what could they have been smoking, right? I mean, this is bizarre. So, this is from just a standard book. I got it out of the library. What do we have here? We have northern Japan, right? And Fukushima's there. You can see Sendai and put it in. And what are those spots? Those spots are earthquakes, epicenters in the last 50 years, 1930 to 1980. And the point here is just there are tons of them, right? Some of them are big, some of them are little, but the numbers by them, I think, refer to years. This is a major part of what's going on. Now, this, in a sense, is not as important as a much more simple, much better slide, which is this. Okay? So what is this? These are earthquakes and tsunami in the Tohoku area. And you've got the epicenter there, and you can see they're basically pretty close. And this is all along that slide that I just showed you. And there are 2 points. Actually, there's 1 point here. And that's that earthquakes and tsunami hit this area all the time, okay? This is not one of those catastrophic but rare events. It's a catastrophic, common, predictable event. It comes every year, right? Earthquakes in northeastern Japan are like Tokyo subways. They just come on time, bam, bam, bam. And not only that, they bring tsunamis, right? I mean, they're complaining about the height of this tsunami, 38.9 meters. Well, yeah, that's a lot. In 1933, there was one that was 38.2, okay? So, you know, this is not as though lawyers can figure this out. You know, this is not as though this is particularly complicated to understand that if you put a nuclear reactor here, you will have an earthquake. We don't know whether it'll be 2011 or but you do know that by 2050 there would be a big earthquake. Maybe not a 9, but it'll be at least an 8, right? And there will be a tsunami, and it's true the 1793 one didn't make much of a tsunami, but otherwise they're at least 20 meters. And you know, it's not as though this starts at 1611. It's just that's when I decided to start the slide. The history goes all way back, and it's basically like clockwork. It's every century there's a big earthquake with a huge, gigantic tsunami. Okay, so how is it that in Japan you go about setting up a nuclear reactor? Well, you know, here's the standard. This comes from METI, which is the bureaucracy that handles these things. But the way in which this works, and the point here is just I'll tell you what this says basically in terms of what matters. But the public utility, which is a privately owned company, picks a site. It does a environmental impact statement. And it then proposes its operating plans. It gets reviewed, and when it's approved, it builds the reactor. And then once it's built, then it's subject to a variety of safety inspections before it can turn it on. And once it turns it on, it's subject to stringent safety inspections that continue. Now, there is lots of litigation over this in Japan. We have this notion somehow, I think, that, you know, Americans litigate and Japanese don't. It's true, Americans litigate, Japanese litigate too. And the opponents of nuclear power, of which there are many in Japan, now even more, but there have been many for a long time, have been filing suits regularly. What happens is 2 things. One is the government says they have what we lawyers call standing. Okay? That means that if you live nearby, your safety is affected, so you have a right to challenge this in court. Okay? And they do, and they spend a lot of time litigating, and the plants get delayed, and eventually the courts say it's safe. Okay? So they win on standing, and they lose on the merits. It turns out this is roughly the opposite of what happens in the U.S., where if you manage somehow to convince a court that you have standing on something like this, you might actually win, but you almost never have standing. So in the U.S., you don't have standing, but if you manage to get it somehow, you might win. In Japan, you have standing, but you don't win. So the outcome is pretty much the same in either way. It's that you lose, but there are delays. And in Japan, as here, time is money. So you know, this is not trivial, the fact that you lose. Both President Seike and Professor Campbell talked about the old people who lived near Fukushima. Well, you know, it's not surprising. Basically, you've got to get when you're moving through this process, you as a utility want to get the people who are living there lined up behind you, because it's true they don't, for the most part, have a veto, but they can come pretty close to preventing you from putting up your reactor. And so this, I think, is from METI again. It talks about the massive amounts of subsidies that are going to come your way if you take this reactor. Right? There are tax revenues, there are jobs, There are explicit subsidies for the certain amount for the first 10 years, and then after the thing goes into operation, another set of subsidies. So who's going to want this? Well, it's going to be the communities that are really poor, right? What do we know about poor communities in Japan? Well, all the people who work have left, right? Which is an exaggeration, obviously, but they tend to have older people because the depressed communities are ones where, because they're depressed, the working age young couples have left and gone off to Tokyo and Osaka and Fukuoka and places like that. So there's a lot of subsidies that come from putting in these reactors to try to overcome the opposition that would otherwise be there, but it does result in their being placed in places that have disproportionately older folks living there. Now, so what happens if you have a accident? Well, this is, for those of you who don't read Japanese, this is just there for graphic entertainment value. For those of you who do read Japanese, you probably don't understand Ramsar because he talks too fast. And this will explain what I'm trying to say. So what's the legal liability for an accident to a power company in Japan for a nuclear reactor? And the answer is, one, the power company is strictly liable for all the damage that it causes. Okay? To pay for it, it has to take out insurance. And the insurance, the amount that is payable is 120 billion yen, which is about $1.5 billion currently. The private insurers, it turns out, don't want to cover things like tsunamis. So what the government does is it says you must buy another insurance from us with the same maximum cap, 120 billion yen, and we'll sell it to you, and it covers that which the private insurer doesn't cover. So that's the basic story, right? The utility is liable in full, strictly liable, no negligence, and then it's got a minor amount of the potential liability is covered by this insurance. Now, curiously, on the right-hand side here, there's another aspect of this which one doesn't see discussed in the literature all that much, which is sort of surprising to me. But it turns out that this liability is limited to those which are not wildly gigantic disasters. So, I'm not sure quite how else to translate the phrase, but if something is really, really wildly huge as a disaster, then Tokyo Electric is not liable at all. Okay, so but that doesn't seem to be entertained much in the discussions about this in Japan, which makes me think, I'm not sure what would be covered by this other than a meteorite coming down and hitting a reactor. But so be it. Here you have the size of power companies in Japan. And what you need to know is that Tokyo Electric there has market capitalization, a third column of, you've got to add a whole bunch of zeros to this. It comes to, let's see, 3.2 trillion yen. Okay, so 3.2 trillion is its market cap before the accident, right? And the total assets are, quite generous, 12 trillion yen, or 13 trillion, but Tokyo Electric has lots of debt, so you obviously have to care about net. What you want is net fire sale value of the assets, right? What could it come up with to pay for the damage? And the net fire sale value of the assets is about 2.5 trillion yen. The total liability, the total amount of damages that one reads, and I think nobody knows at this point, but the estimates that I saw were something about 2.5 to 4 trillion yen or more. And if I had to guess, my guess would fall in the or more category. And the point here is simply that Tokyo Electric, by far the biggest of Japanese utilities, doesn't have the assets that it needs to pay for this. Right? So that's what gives rise to the moral hazard that I think goes into the necessarily goes into the siting of this. Now, for most industries, this isn't an issue for large companies. We talk about, I teach corporate law, we talk about the limitations, the problems created by limited liability when companies can't pay their tort liabilities. But usually we're talking about little New York City taxi cab companies that buy the minimum insurance and then run down people. And we're not talking about large exchange-listed companies. You know, the BP oil disaster was a good contrary example to my point, that in fact it does happen once in a while. But it doesn't happen very often. But nuclear power is one place where it happens all the time. Okay? Now so that's private ownership. Would government ownership be any better? And I think not. It's not just that governments tend not to run industries very well, and they don't run them well. It's that the electoral dynamics of modern rich democracies, I think, combine to create exactly the same moral hazard that private firms have. And here's the way it works, right? You have regulators. Regulators work for politicians. They always do. I mean, that's just the way it's structured. It doesn't matter if they pretend that they don't. They do. Politicians work for voters because otherwise they won't get reelected. They won't stay politicians, right? And the way this is usually put, and you know, there are all sorts of exceptions, is that politicians answer to the median voter, the guy in the middle. You answer to the voter in the middle because that's the way you get the most votes. And if you don't, you lose and you don't stay around. So what do we know about the policies that are involved in nuclear power? Well, one is that politicians are setting the rates, right? Because in Japan, as here, electricity is sold by regulated rates. They will be set at rates that are attractive to the median voter. Okay? What else do we know? Well, it is that when there's a disaster in Japan, the government may and probably will choose to pay the ultimate cost of it. And certainly if the government owned public utility, it would pay. And so you can say, well, then we don't have moral hazard, right? But that's not true, because politicians answer to the median voter, and the median voter doesn't pay, right? And it's simply a natural response of having a very radical, progressive tax system like we have here and like we have in Japan. Right? And you can quarrel about the numbers, but you know, sort of one way it's put is that half the taxpayers in the U.S. don't pay any tax. Another way it's put in Japan is that about 20% of the taxpayers pay about 80% of the tax. So if you're answering to the median voter as a politician, you're not answering to the person who's bearing the cost of the disaster. You're answering to the person who's paying only a much smaller portion of it, because the loss that comes to the public treasury doesn't come out of the median voter's pocket. It comes disproportionately out of the 20% who are paying 80% of the income tax. So what is this? How does this all work out? Well, it means that politicians who stay in office will be ones who provide electricity cheaply to the median voter. The median voter will also want this reactor sited in somebody else's backyard. So it will be sited at a place not that's optimal in terms of size and logical considerations, but in terms of what it takes for the sitting politicians to get reelected, which are not the same things. And it will be, and the costs that will be considered will not be those that are the total costs. It'll be those that reflect the burden that's going to be held by the voter in the middle, the one who is paying actually a relatively small percentage of the tax burden, simply because of the way in which the progressive tax system works. Okay, so yeah. So why was the Japanese nuclear reactors, why are they placed in unsafe places? Partly they're placed in unsafe places because there aren't any safe ones in Japan. But they're placed in particularly unsafe places because they are privately owned by corporations that will not pay the full cost of the accident when it happens. Would having the government own it make it any better? Answer is no. Quite possibly it might actually make it worse, because it would not be run efficiently either. Okay, now, that sort of leaves you with the question of, so would anyone, right? I mean, it's, There's no oil in Japan. There's no coal. The rivers are all dammed up. You couldn't get any more out of them. And solar energy and wind energy aren't likely to work. Yeah, I mean, that sounds right. But, you know, I don't have an answer. I do, you know, what I can say is I live in Lexington, which is a suburb of Boston. And it's sort of it seems to be the home of choice for the MIT faculty, MIT alums, because it's near the software highway, basically 128, where all the engineering firms are. So I end up having lots of MIT folks as friends, and including some nuclear physicists. And the way they put it is like, yeah, well, these things happen. It's part of it. And the other part of it was, I think the way one friend put it last weekend, you know, any arrangement for energy of any kind is a pact with the devil. You know, that may end up just being about right. Thank you very much.